Expenses are the part of a car sharing fleet that no one, including myself, likes to talk about. But like any business, expenses are a crucial part of the equation that you need to be prepared for and take into account whenever you're thinking about starting or growing a car sharing fleet. And so in this video, I'm going to be breaking down some of the expenses that you can expect with a car sharing fleet, how to cut down on those expenses, and some of the ones that may be avoidable entirely. But before we dive into that, I do want to remind you all that my course, the Car Sharing Masterclass, is on sale until January 21st. And you can get the course for $150 off by using the code NEWYEAR2024. This course is a very in-depth guide teaching you everything that you need to know about starting and scaling a car sharing fleet with the same model that I've used over the years to grow my own. You'll learn how to buy cars, how to determine which cars are the best ones to buy, and how to get at below market value deals on the cars that you purchase. You'll learn how to operate your business like a pro by taking advantage of remote key exchanges and automatic messages. And we'll also go over things like accounting, business and LLC information, insurance, what happens if your car is in an accident or potentially a total loss, as well as everything in between. And the best part is, whenever you sign up for the course, not only do you gain access to 7 hours of course content, but you'll also be invited to our private Discord and our monthly private Zoom calls as well. So if you'd like to check it out, you can do so by following the link down in the description below and using the code NEWYEAR2024 to get $150 off. Now back to the video. Now, like I said a moment ago, car sharing is no different than any business out there, and there is absolutely going to be expenses that you should be prepared for. Insurance is really the first and most obvious one, and HP and I pay about $55 per car per month for our insurance costs. Now, our vehicles have liability only, and we insure through ABI period X. And I know what you guys are going to say whenever you watch this video, because I get comments like this all the time. People who say, hey, I called ABI period X, and they're saying that it's going to cost between $70 and $80 per month. How the heck are you paying $55? And that is, again, because we're liability only. If you get full comprehensive and liability coverage, that's going to be closer to $70 to $80, whereas if you have just liability, you can cut the cost dramatically. Now, insurance is a required cost for a car sharing fleet. If you have cars on Turo or really any car sharing platform out there, you have to have third-party insurance. This is a non-negotiable. But the type of insurance that you have and the amount that you pay can vary depending on a few different factors, including the types of cars that you own, your own driving record, the insurance carrier that you go with, what type of coverage you choose, as well as how you pay for it. Because HP and I have normal, very cheap cars that we never drive for personal use, having liability for our cars makes a ton of sense. And because of that, we have liability-only coverage on all of our vehicles except for our personal car, our camper van, and our Lincoln Navigator. Because in the case of the Lincoln Navigator, it'd be silly to have liability only on a nearly $40,000 car. Again, the ability to have liability only is one of the many benefits of having cheap, normal, everyday economical cars, because it makes sense to have liability only insurance. Whereas with a car like a Lincoln Navigator, the insurance costs are quite a bit more. But like I mentioned a moment ago, even though insurance costs are a non-negotiable and you're going to have to pay this one way or another, there are still ways and methods that you can take of decreasing your insurance costs without decreasing coverage. For example, with our camper van, we pay 12 months at a time, and this gives us about a 10% discount. We also do the same thing with our personal policy. We pay every time the policy renews, which is once every 6 months. And I believe this saves us anywhere between 5 and 10%. Insurance is definitely a personal thing, and all of these factors are going to go into play in addition to where you actually live and operate your business out of. So I definitely encourage you to do your research, price shop different insurance companies, and do some due diligence in figuring out what type of coverage you actually need. A second cost that many Turo hosts have is a car payment. Now, a car payment is sort of a double-edged sword because for many Turo hosts, it is the only way that they can actually get started with Turo. And I've made probably hundreds of videos on my channel over the years talking about my thoughts on a car payment. And while I don't think that a car payment in and of itself is necessarily a bad thing, I think that this can be abused relatively easily. And I certainly am not an advocate of having a fleet of financed cars. Currently, with my 29 cars, only one is financed, and it's one of my more recent purchases, which is the Lincoln Navigator. Obviously, a car payment is going to be part of your month-by-month expenses, and the amount that you pay is going to depend on the car you buy, how much you put down, the interest rate, as well as the term. If you finance a car, you'll have a car payment. If you don't, you won't. And cars that don't have car payments are, in general, significantly higher margin. Maintenance costs is another expense, and more than likely, this is going to be probably one of your highest expenses as a car sharing host. I would put both maintenance and repairs into this category, though I know that they technically are different. Maintenance and repairs is an expense that can get out of hand really, really quickly if you're not keeping an eye on it, which is why it's so important to figure out ways to reduce maintenance and repairs costs without reducing the quality of the maintenance of your vehicles. I really put maintenance and repairs into two different categories. You have your required maintenance and repairs. These are types of maintenance work or repairs that have to be done to a car, either because of the age or because of the mileage. For example, regardless of how reliable a car is, at some point in time, you're going to have to replace its suspension. Every single car, regardless of the year, make, and model, are going to need your traditional maintenance items, like windshield wipers, brake pads, rotors, an oil change if it's a gas vehicle. These type of expenses are like insurance unavoidable, but there are ways that you can reduce the costs of these expenses. And then, of course, you also have your one-off maintenance as well. These are maintenance costs that are much less predictable, and they are oftentimes much more expensive, so things like a blown AC, a bad engine, bad transmission, things like that. And while whenever it comes to maintenance and repairs, there are a ton of different ways that you can reduce the cost of this category of expenses without reducing any of the quality. In fact, in some cases, it might actually increase the quality of the repair. And truthfully, I could probably make one standalone video about this topic alone because there is just so much to say. And where HP and I cut a ton of costs in this area isn't by doing maintenance less, it's instead by buying the parts and tools for that maintenance in advance. For example, we're constantly looking to see who's selling the cheapest oil, and when the oil goes on sale, we buy hundreds of dollars worth, as much as we can fit into the garage. For a long time, this was Amazon, sometimes it's Walmart, sometimes it's Costco, Sam's. Basically, whoever is selling oil for the cheapest, we will buy it in bulk. But we don't reduce the quality of oil that we buy simply to take advantage of a sale. We buy the same quality that we would buy every single time, we just buy it at a discount. HP really leads the charge on this oil hunt, but in general, we pay between $25 and $35 for an oil change. Of course, this varies depending on the car. And this does include oil, filters, and labor, because HP is doing it. And buying in bulk doesn't just apply to oil, though it's one of the more applicable examples of this because a Turo host needs a lot of oil, but it can be applied to anything that you need to buy on a reoccurring basis. Another way that we save a ton of money with expenses and repairs is by having corporate accounts set up with any vendor that we can. I've talked about this a lot in my videos in the past, but a corporate account is an excellent way to save money without sacrificing any quality at all. Most retailers in the automotive space will have what is called a corporate account, and basically what you do is you give them your LLC information, and then whenever you buy anything from that location or that vendor, you tell them what company you're with, and they give you corporate pricing. AutoZone, O'Reilly's, Firestone, Discount Tire, even dealerships like Ford or Toyota have corporate pricing. And the amount that you save with a corporate account varies quite a bit from part to part and from vendor to vendor, but over the course of a year, if you have enough cars, this can result in thousands of dollars in savings. Now, the exact way that you go about creating a corporate account does vary from vendor to vendor, but I would recommend doing is checking out their website or calling them up directly, asking them if they have a corporate account, and then just following the steps that they give you. Sometimes this involves just giving them your LLC or EIN. In the past, we sometimes had to give things like filing paperwork, and recently a local Ford dealership requested to see a business card with our address and our LLC name. But in general, the process is very easy and it saves you a ton of money. Tires are another key component that, depending on the type of car you have, can add up extremely quickly, especially if you're renting your car on Turo, because the reality is Turo guests abuse cars like crazy, and as a result, your tires are going to have to be replaced more frequently than your personal car will. This is another hidden benefit of having a corporate account, as well as just having cheaper cars, because of the fact that cheap cars have cheap tires in general. And because of this, we pay anywhere between $50 and $80 for the tires that are on our cars. This in and of itself is a great way to save money. But for those of you who don't rent out or don't own cheap cars like we do, a great way that you can save money on quality tires is to not sleep on used tires. Now, what I'm not talking about here is tires that are being sold out of the back of a pickup truck that have had their tread redone. But what I am talking about is slightly used tires that for whatever reason they're being sold. This is particularly common with sports or performance cars. And while I don't buy used tires for my Turo fleet because we don't need to, because our tires are already cheap, if I had performance cars in my Turo fleet, I absolutely would buy used tires. In fact, I would consider buying used tires for the Lincoln Navigator, and if I still had the Maserati Ghibli, I'd probably buy it for that car as well. But a great example of this in practice is my husband's GT500. My husband drives a 2020 GT500. He does not rent it out on Turo, so it is exclusive for personal use. And recently he needed new tires for his car. And these tires are very, very expensive, like $500 per tire. He was made aware of somebody in the local car community who had a Porsche that was selling the exact tires that he was looking for. And this guy was selling his basically brand new tires that had just been taken off of his car for $350 all in. They technically weren't brand new, but they were as close to brand new as a used tire could be. And my husband paid $350 for 4 of them rather than paying $2,000. And so moving forward, whenever we do need to buy these more expensive tires, we're going to be keeping our eye out for the used ones rather than automatically defaulting to new. Just be sure that you can actually verify that these tires are in fact new, and there are a lot of really easy ways to do this, like checking the tread, making sure that there isn't dry rot, and even checking out the date of the tire itself. And before anyone says it, I know what some of you guys may be thinking. You shouldn't be buying a car if you can't afford the tires, but there is a big difference between being able to afford the tires and wanting to pay full price. Sure, if we wanted to, we could spend $2,000 on tires, but why would we if we could get the exact same quality for a fraction of the price? But on the same topic of maintenance, let's talk about some of the maintenance that is less predictable and less routine. I alluded to this earlier, but this would be things like maybe body damage, blown ACs, engines, and transmissions. Whenever it comes to this more expensive one-off type of damage, we typically have two sources that we look to first, whenever applicable that is, and that is eBay and junkyards. This is specifically helpful whenever it comes to cosmetic damage and parts on your car that you want to replace cosmetically, whether it be a door panel, a fender, a bumper, whatever the case is. eBay and junkyards are really great options to go down because you can find quality parts at a really cheap price. We have in the past gone to junkyards and got fully painted OEM fenders for $100 when those exact same parts from the factory would be thousands. And on eBay, there are some great vendors that sell pre-painted parts that may not be exactly like OEM, but they are pretty close and they're at a steep discount. This is my go-to whenever needed. In addition to junkyards or eBay, there are a lot of great retailers out there that may not be quite OEM, but they are pretty close and they are significantly cheaper, like Rock Auto or LKQ. LKQ even has some stellar warranties. But you do want to be careful whenever it comes to these types of parts and repairs that you make at a discount, because not all aftermarket parts are created equal, and sometimes buying the OEM more expensive part the first time around is the better decision. There are some parts and pieces of a car that aftermarket really make no difference whatsoever. I am a firm believer that buying aftermarket cosmetic parts make zero difference to the car, and I will go aftermarket every single day of the week. There are also some really great engine and transmission retailers out there that can sell these parts for a steep discount that are pretty dang close to OEM. But there are some other parts here or there where it is just better to buy directly from the factory. And the problem is many of these parts do vary from car to car and manufacturer to manufacturer, so I can't sit here and tell you which parts you should or should not buy aftermarket. But I can give you some examples of my own cars that I originally bought cheap parts and I ended up regretting it later on. One perfect example is a car that isn't even a Turo car, it's my personal car, my 1997 4Runner. My husband rebuilt my 4Runner a number of years ago whenever we were just dating, and at the time we didn't have a ton of money, so he used budget parts to build out my entire suspension. Well, 2 years after that, my suspension had to be replaced again because these budget parts just weren't holding up, and we ended up having to go back and replace everything with higher quality, nicer parts. This time we didn't cheap out and we got the more expensive alternatives. Another great option is potentially motor mounts. HP and I have found that on some of our cars, buying cheaper motor mounts significantly reduce the lifespan of those motor mounts. But this does vary a bit from car to car. For example, on Ford Focuses, getting cheap motor mounts doesn't really matter. Or even brake pads. We have in the past purchased cheap brake pads for our Mercedes, and this is almost always a mistake. Because cheaper brake pads on a Mercedes, at least in our experience, result in more squeaking, which gives the guest the illusion that the brakes are going bad. And every time that this has happened, we've ended up replacing the brake pads with more expensive ones, and it has solved the problem. And now with our Mercedes, we no longer buy cheap brake pads as a result. This is sort of a trial and error thing that you'll have to figure out with your own fleet, but sometimes buying cheap isn't better, and you can end up saving money in the long run by just buying something more expensive and more high quality. Another great way to save some money when it comes to repairs and maintenance is buying parts with lifetime warranties. We do this quite often with O'Reilly's. I'm not 100% sure which vendors offer lifetime warranties on parts, but I know that O'Reilly's does on quite a lot of them. It is very common for us on parts that we know are going to have to be replaced often to buy parts that have lifetime warranties with those, even if they're more expensive. A perfect example of this was with my previous Jeep that I used to own in the EGR valve. EGR valves on Jeep Wranglers are notorious for going bad, and my Jeep was no exception. When we had to replace it the first time, we bought one without the lifetime warranty. The second time, we bought it with the lifetime warranty, and we ended up having to replace the EGR valve 3 additional times after that. Each time, the part was free. Yeah, it was a little bit more expensive up front, but it ended up saving us money in the long run. And this is something that you should keep in mind for yourself. Now, these are just a few of the examples of how you can reduce maintenance and repairs costs without reducing the quality of the repair and maintenance that you're performing on your cars. But the point is, maintenance and repairs are probably going to be one of your biggest expense categories, and there are really great ways that you can reduce this without sacrificing any safety. Another unavoidable cost to your Turo fleet is going to be tools to operate your fleet. fleet. And the amount of tools that you buy and what type of tools you need will depend on your involvement in your fleet. If you're someone who's wanting to work on all of your cars, then you will obviously need a lot more tools and supplies than somebody who doesn't want to work on your cars at all. But regardless, there are going to be some staple tools that you probably need to have. Things like screwdrivers, pry bars, maybe even a ratchet or an impact wrench, a good vacuum, cleaning supplies. These are all things that, in my opinion, are things that a Turo host should always have, because you never know whenever you're late to do something that will require one of these tools. Having a jack and a jack stand is also a really great idea. HP and I typically practice the belief of whenever we buy a tool for the first time, we will oftentimes buy the cheapest version of that tool. Oftentimes that's from Harbor Freight. And if the tool ends up breaking, we will then replace that tool with a more expensive, higher quality alternative. Because if we use the cheap version and then it ends up breaking, this tells us that number one, we used the tool enough to break it, and number two, the cheap version wasn't on par with what we really needed. But oftentimes you'll find that with these cheap tools, they end up getting the job done quite well. For example, screwdrivers. A $5 screwdriver isn't really any different from a $20 screwdriver. But in general, HP and I are pretty big advocates of investing into the right tools that you need for your Turo fleet. Having bad tools and bad supplies will end up costing you money in the long time, but more importantly, it'll cost you a lot of time. For example, having a bad vacuum may be cheaper than having a really good one, but you're going to end up spending more time cleaning that car. The name of our Turo game has been efficiency the last couple of years, and as a result, we make sure to invest in the tools that we need to be as efficient as possible. And this oftentimes involves us buying tools on Black Friday and during big sales. We've occasionally even looked at things like estate sales that we haven't really bought anything from them, buying from Harbor Freight when applicable, and just buying it when we need it. At this point, we have most of the tools that we need, so we don't really spend a ton on tools, but in previous years, we have definitely taken advantage of big sales like Black Friday. The last thing that I'm going to say whenever it comes to maintenance and repairs expenses is to keep tabs of how much money you're spending on each individual car. This is incredibly important because you want to make sure that you aren't spending too much on repairs and maintenance for a vehicle. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, maintenance can really go into two categories: the routine, unavoidable maintenance, and this isn't really a big deal. But you're also going to have the maintenance that pops up due to repairs or maintenance issues, like a transmission, engine, AC, whatever the case is. And you want to make sure that the amount that you're spending on each car when it comes to repairs and maintenance makes sense compared to how much that car is making. And the amount of money that makes sense to spend will depend on the type of car, how much money it's made, its historical repair costs and earnings, as well as a variety of other factors. But the sunk cost fallacy is a very real thing in car sharing, and this is the idea that, hey, I already spent $10,000 fixing this car. If I only spend $2,000 more, then I will be done and it will be back on the road. But that stamp of approval after that $2,000 has been spent is never guaranteed, and you want to make sure that the amount that you're spending on repairs and maintenance makes sense. And while I never spend $10,000 on my own cars because that's more than my cars are worth, I do oftentimes have to ask myself after spending a few grand on a car if it's worth it to spend more. And I do keep this sunk cost fallacy in the back of my mind. And the last expense category that I want to talk about is probably the most fun, and that is expenses that you're already paying but now can be absorbed into the business because you're operating a business. Things like your internet bill, your phone, your laptop, maybe you have a charger or some sort of storage subscription. These are all expenses that can now be deemed a business expense, and thus they should be paid for by the business, and they can be tax deductible. And while you shouldn't spend money frivolously just because it can be used as a business expense, this is a great way to be able to justify certain expenses that you maybe wouldn't have otherwise been able to justify, like a new laptop or new iPad, or new car parts, or new tools. The list goes on and on. This is particularly fun once you start making money because you can start spending more of your money on the wants, not the needs for the business. And that is the most fun category to spend in. But there you guys have it, some of the expenses that you should expect to spend with a car sharing fleet and where you could potentially cut down some of these costs. Like always, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.